So the story goes, in 1968, a young Pittsburgh filmmaker by the name of George Romero was just completing his debut film, a horror movie that was destined to completely change the face of horror and in a lot of ways the face of filmmaking, period. This movie, which was about zombies coming back from the dead and eating people, was the first time in American cinemas that the monsters in a movie were real people in a real place that you knew. Not a gothic castle, not some kind of nightmare, but just people you knew in a place you knew attacking you. And that changed the whole world. And this movie, as you all know, was called Night of Anubis. Except George Romero came to his senses and changed the title to the more honest Night of the Living Dead. They made a second title card saying Night of the Living Dead, and they didn't put the copyright information at the bottom. A obscure piece of copyright law in America circa 1968 means that if you don't specify on your film a copyright notice, your film is in the public domain immediately, which means you have no copyright over it, you can make no money off of it. Because of this, and because Night of the Living Dead was such an exceptional movie, Night of the Living Dead is like the most sequeled movie possibly ever. So I made a chart for you, the first time that I'm aware of, that all the progeny of Night of the Living Dead have been assembled in one document. The first follow-up to Night of the Living Dead in 1978 was Romero's own sequel, Dawn of the Dead, released in Italy under the title of Zombie. That's the version of the film that Dario Argento edited, which you can see all the different versions of Dawn of the Dead. Zombie was a big deal in Italy. So, the next year, Lucio Fulci is working on his Caribbean set zombie film, a film totally unrelated to Dawn of the Dead, and he titles his film Zombie 2. Which is an attempt to cash in on the first film to trick people into thinking it was a sequel to the first movie. And it worked. Zombie 2 had nearly as much box office success as Dawn of the Dead, Zombie 1, and it started a cottage industry of its own. There are 6 separate films calling themselves Zombie 3, and 2 of them came out before not only Zombie 2, but Zombie 1, Dawn of the Dead. They were retitled to be sequels to this movie that they had nothing to do with. In Italy, they were doing this well into the 80s and 90s. Zombie 6, Monster Hunter, which, by the way, came out 6 years after Zombie 5, but was retitled. Zombie 6 is actually the sequel to the movie that goes by Zombie 7, Anthropophagus, both of which were released well before Zombie 3, 4, 5. Zombie 8 is actually the 4th film in the Tombs of the Blind Dead series. Tombs of the Blind Dead 1 is also known as Mark of the Devil Part 4, because they were trying to do the same thing there that they were doing elsewhere with the zombie movies. And there is no Mark of the Devil 3 that I could ever find. They went Mark of the Devil 2, leapt to 4, and then Tombs of the Blind Dead was a bigger success than Mark of the Devil 1 or 2, so they just reset the naming scheme until Zombie came out. And this went on for a long time until it stopped being profitable in about the early 90s. In America, a different sort of thing happened. Dawn of the Dead is sort of the flashpoint to the European zombie thing. Night is very much, to this day, still the more relevant one in America. Instead of all these sequels, people just started remaking and recutting Night of the Living Dead. It's been colorized 3 times and converted to 3D once. There are 6 different remakes of Night of the Living Dead, 2 of which have sequels of their own. There is 1 remake of Dawn of the Dead, which has 2 sequels of its own. There is 1 out-of-continuity sequel and 1 remake to Day of the Dead. Now, all of these are unofficial sequels and unofficial remakes and unofficial recuts that had nothing to do with Romero or John Russo, the director and screenwriter, respectively, of Night of the Living Dead. But both of them have their own series. George Romero obviously made his sequel Dawn of the Dead in 78, Day of the Dead in 1985, Land of the Dead 20 years later in 2005, Diary of the Dead in 2007, and Survival of the Dead in 2009. Diary of the Dead's an interesting one because it's in continuity a sequel to the 4 films before it, but it's actually also a remake of Night of the Living Dead because it resets the zombie invasion to the beginning, and it's also under the working title Land of the Dead 2. So it's the 2nd, 5th, and 1st films in its particular series. John Russo, the writer, split with Romero and started his own series of official sequels, beginning with The Return of the Living Dead in 1985, Return of the Living Dead 2 in 1988, Return of the Living Dead 3, 4, and 5 came later. Return of the Living Dead 2 also has an Italian sequel, Zombie 4. Zombie 4 also bills itself as Zombie Flesh Eaters 3, which was the English title of Zombie 1. So if you want to be technical, Zombie 4 in 88 is the 5th sequel to Night of the Living Dead, the 3rd sequel to Dawn of the Dead, the 3rd sequel to Zombie, and the 3rd sequel to The Return of the Living Dead, and it has nothing to do with any of those films in any way. So thanks for taking this tour through the weird world of official and unofficial sequels to Night of the Living Dead. We at Smug Film actually recorded a podcast not too long ago where we talked about Night of the Living Dead for a very long time. You can find a link to that in the YouTube page for this. Please enjoy that and the rest of our show. I'm John D'Amico. Thanks a lot.